This is the par form post-settlement possession addendum to agreement of sale, POS, found in your .loop full library of documents. So this form is in the event that a seller needs to stay in the property for up to 30 days post-closing. This might be because the seller is buying another property and for whatever reason, they need to have the cash in hand in order for the seller of the next property to agree to put them under contract and sell it to them. Or let's say the buyer wanted to lock in their interest rate, but the seller's new job didn't start for 90 days. So they didn't want to move out 60 days later. They wanted to move out 90 days later. So buyer and seller agree that if they settle within 60 days, the buyer can lock in their rate, and then the seller stays on in the property for another 30 days. I have seen this form used for longer than 30 days, but the recommended purpose of this is not a lease agreement. It's just for a 30-day period beyond closing where the seller stays in the property. So paragraph 2, you want to indicate the date by which the seller needs to leave the property, and you need to indicate the per diem fee that the seller will pay the buyer. So let's say they agree to $30 a day and they want to stay for an additional 10 days. So they would pay the buyer $300, and they either pay that by check directly to the buyer, or let's say there's no seller assist already, or there's room to add seller assist. You can just add in the $300 seller assist. So basically the seller is giving $300 back to the buyer. Deposit. So just like in a lease agreement, you would have a security deposit. So you may decide that the seller will put 1 or 2 months worth of what would be a rental payment or a mortgage payment in escrow that will be held by the buyer until the seller vacates the property. And the buyer will inspect the property within 2 days after the seller vacating the property to confirm that it's the same condition that they expected it to be in, and then they'd refund the money. And of course, if there are damages, then they would have to work through that together and apply any of that security deposit to pay for the damages. Under paragraph 6, this is indicating that the seller will still be responsible for certain utilities from closing until they move out. And if they have pets, you want to include that here. The seller is going to maintain the property in the current condition minus normal wear and tear. And then, of course, if the buyer has specific rules of occupancy, they would attach it to the addendum. The seller cannot make any alterations or improvements to the property. And I would recommend that the seller be required to obtain or convert their current insurance policy into a renter's policy. And you want to make sure that it covers their contents and their liabilities. So if, for example, the seller's current homeowner's insurance provided for $50,000 worth of contents coverage and $300,000 in liability, then their renter's policy should be the similar amounts. Entry. So just like in a lease, the buyer would have access to the property. They'd get keys at settlement, and they'd be able to enter the property with 24 hours notice, unless in case of an emergency. This discusses seller's default, which ideally won't happen, but that is one of the risks of having the seller stay in the property beyond the settlement date. And then the seller may not assign their rights under the addendum to anybody else. And the seller is going to hold everybody harmless in case of an issue. And ultimately, this addendum survives settlement. Most other issues are wrapped up with settlement, and the consummation of settlement is satisfaction of all of the contingencies. This survives settlement. So of course, your buyer should always seek legal counsel if they are considering allowing a seller to stay in the property beyond the settlement date.